Thank you so much, Sean, for giving up so much of your morning. You've not had much sleep. I appreciate that.
a bit.
From Anglia Ruskin University. What's your full title? Go on, press us.
I'm Senior Lecturer in History at Anglia Ruskin, and I also teach some politics. With
a special interest in politics. Has that always been your forte or your passion?
Well, I mean, history and politics go together very, very closely, particularly if you do the sort of standard history, which is what I grew up with. So, yes, it's been a long-standing interest, yeah.
I'm interested in these, obviously, lots of formerly red seats turned blue, and some of these formerly red seats, quite a shock to turn blue. I'm wondering how that feels for constituents living in that constituency. There's maybe, solid Labour for decades and decades to suddenly become a Conservative seat. Does there become a sort of disconnect between the MP and the community, or is it actually a massive sea change that can go on and on?
It can be either. I mean, this could be a temporary thing, and indeed Boris Johnson was recognising that in his speech this morning. And the challenge for him is to make sure that it's not temporary, that that this does become a sea change for them. It can do. I mean, if you take Cambridge, back in the day, this was an absolutely standard, normal Conservative seat with a long-running, MP, and now you wouldn't think that. And it's the local economy and community can change. A new generation can come up. There are all sorts of things that can actually change, almost without people who are living there realising that they're changing. And the political identity of the town is part of the identity that it feels as a whole, which would include its economy, the sort of work that people do. And when that changes, and it can, when industry moves on, technology moves on. We've seen this with mining villages and pit villages, and some of those areas have now gone Conservative. Then you can find yourself in a very different sort of place. I am thinking of some of the areas like Liverpool, which had a major sort of facelift in the 90s. So that although it's never going to, I sort of thought it's never going to vote Conservative, but the type of city that it is very different from the city back in the days of the great ports and so on.
So what's happened here? I don't quite. It's not as if we've suddenly become a university city with Labour voting students or anything like that. It's what has changed in Cambridge?
This, I think, is Thatcher. I think that's what made the change in Cambridge originally, so that Cambridge became a sort of left of centre one. Now, an interesting way of measuring that is the teaching profession, because it's easy to forget this. In fact, some people would hardly believe it, but teachers as a profession were overwhelmingly Conservative voting until the Thatcher period and the teacher strikes. And I think, in a sense, it's the same time period that Cambridge sort of stopped being a Conservative one and became a broadly left of centre one. It might be Lib Dem, might be
and by teachers, do we extend that to I'm not going to ask you how you vote, but do we extend that to lecturers and professors?
I mean, lecturers, I think, no, I don't have any data here, so this is entirely impressive.
Staff room, I know that way.
Exactly, but I mean, generally speaking, university lecturers were better known for being more radical, particularly. Well, it depends which sort of university, but the sort of later newer universities had a reputation for I'm thinking Malcolm Bradbury and the History Man and that sort of thing.
Right.
So there, I think it's been less of a change. But as in general, the sort of shall I call it the educated classes? But you know what I mean. The sort of the teaching, the lecturing classes have moved leftwards, and I think undoubtedly it's the 80s is the period when that change happened. I mean, we know that in terms of, as I say, in terms of the teaching profession, because there were surveys done at the time. So yeah, that's the sort of change that can happen, and I think the Thatcher era was the watershed for many areas.
So Cambridge's last MP would have been elected. No, I'm trying to remember the dates. Last Conservative in Cambridge, is it 87, 89?
Oh, no, that was earlier. Well, it's Roberts Rhodes James, and I can't remember when he retired.
I think it was sort of later. Then, of course, Anne Campbell took it for Labour.
Anne Campbell, exactly. And she had it for a long time. And that is the sort of change in outlook that can happen to a community, to a town. Now, you're quite right. Cambridge didn't have some sort of major change in its local economy or anything like that in the way that other areas, particularly in the north of England, did. But the move from the traditional industries like shipbuilding and coal mining to particularly to the digital industry means that the type of people working there of a different sort of social outlook and particularly different social aspirations.
And despite the fact that people live in South Cambridgeshire and come and work in Cambridge, there hasn't really been the transformation in the South Cambridgeshire constituency in any way? No, really.
Well, it depends which end of South Cambridge you're talking about.
Well, yeah, but the constituency as a whole.
There's a whole.
Must acknowledge, of course, Queen Edith.
Yes, and the sort of Addenbrooke's area around there, which is growing, and we'll have to see how that develops.
I guess we might see more in the city council elections and district council elections rather than in a parliamentary election.
Yes, and I think that's right, because one sees in South Cambs over in the last county council elections where the Lib Dems did much better than I think that people had expected. But I mean, in general terms, around the country, if you're sort of talking about, can this change become permanent? As I say, that is the challenge for the government. They've got to make that so. But Brexit is rather like the Thatcher revolution, is that sort of fault line. It is that sort of watershed. So it's not impossible. Never think that because the town you grew up with was a particular way, that it's going to stay that way even within your own lifetime. That it can change.
It will be interesting. Once Brexit is done, in inverted commas, whether those Conservative voting seats then go back to Labour. That was the issue that they voted Conservative on, and whether they will return to the traditional voting patterns.
But since Brexit isn't, whatever he might say, isn't going to be done by the end of January, it is going to be a long process. Much will depend on how that narrative of a long process is spun. Is it we've been let down by the Conservatives, in which case you could easily have a sort of return to another to the former loyalties, or is it they've been foiled by the fiendish enemy, whoever that might be? Now, we've just had it where the enemy was Parliament, but it could easily be the EU in the negotiations or something like that. So it all depends on how the narrative is spun, and if the narrative is that he's doing his best and he's up against forces who are trying to do him down, therefore then you could easily carry on and rally round and support him.
It's like a children's kit, isn't it? You get at Christmas, make your own opposition.
Yeah, entirely. Yes,
kind of.
This is part of the game of government. Mrs. Thatcher was perfect at it. Was a very, very good model at this. She created her own opposition, and she was very lucky in her enemies as well. And I'm talking about the leaders of the Labour Party, Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock. I'm talking about the Argentinian junta. I'm talking about Arthur Scargill and the miners, even indeed the teachers' unions. Each of them sort of played into her hands and played into her narrative very, very effectively. So if you can, your enemies are the way of defining yourself. And if you get the right enemies, and if you haven't got them, you shape them. And that way you define the sort of person you are and get your support accordingly.
Can I quickly mention that Robert Rhodes James won for the Conservatives in 1983 and 1987, and Campbell won for Labour in the 1992 election. So that was the one where nobody thought John Major would win, and he did.
I should have said I had it written down in my notebook.
He does have a little notebook as well.
I have a little notebook, yes, indeed, yes.
I didn't look this up myself. Can I just say that Dom, who is in Studio B doing some videos of the
He's our elf
broadcast today, is...
Or election elf.
Beware, it's International Christmas Jumper Day. Dom fed me the information there.
We're going to release you back into the wild very soon, Sean, but there are kind of standout years in elections where it seems the political landscape changes. There's 87, 97, arguably. Does this feel like another standout one that we'll look back on yet?
Oh yes, absolutely. When people were saying in the campaign that this is the biggest election, the most important of their lifetime, that wasn't exaggeration. I mean, it's not the only one, but 97, 79, 45. Yeah, these are the big ones, and this joins those ranks. Yeah.
And a period of reflection, Jeremy Corbyn has said. I don't know what that means. A period of argument, I would have imagined. Yeah. It's interesting. A lot of political leaders stand down directly after a defeat at a general election.
To be fair, there have been those who said that, for example, Ed Miliband was too quick to stand down after his defeat, it has become that. Michael Howard, I remember, sort of stepped down the next day after the election as leader of the Conservative Party. It never used to be quite like this, and who can argue against a period of reflection? But as you say, I think reflection isn't quite the way it's going to be. It's going to be out and out warfare, I think.
It's going to be a hard role for him afterwards, isn't it, in Parliament? A lot of people will have felt let down by him. He's had 2 election defeats. Sitting in the Commons, it's going to be difficult.
Politics is a ruthless game, and if you're not prepared for that, don't go in for it. And and Enoch Powell is the one who said all political careers end in failure, and it has to be said the evidence is quite strong on his side.
Expecting to hear a statement from Mr. Corbyn at 11:30 this morning. We'll bring that to you. I think this is going to be one of those pool audio things, so we may not get it live, but we'll bring that to you when it pops up here.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Sean. What's the rest of your day hold in store for you?
I'm giving a talk. I'm giving a lecture actually about the implications of the election for the prime ministership in Europe and things like that. And then I'm on Look East this evening.
It's all go, isn't it? And then you're going to have a long sleep.
Yes. I hope. Then I'm going to the Wind in the Willows.
That's nice. Oh, that's
At Junction,
perfect.
yeah?
Yes. At the ADC.
Right.
And try not to read any political metaphors.
None whatsoever in a book which is entirely a political book, actually.
Thank you very much for your time this morning, Sean.